Lee Iacocca drove the first one out himself. Summer 1980, the Jefferson Avenue plant. Workers lined the floor, clapping, cheering. Chrysler had been weeks from collapse, and this boxy, unassuming little sedan was the reason it wasn't. The K-car, the car that would save 600,000 jobs, the car that would pay back the government 7 years early, the car that would give Detroit one more chance. Iacocca looked into the cameras. "If you can find a better car, buy it," the crowd roared. 10 years later, February 2nd, 1990, he closed the plant. No cameras, no champagne, no speech, just 1,700 workers walking out through the same gates for the last time into a Detroit winter that didn't care. The Jefferson Avenue Assembly Plant had stood for 82 years. It had survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and 4 decades of corporate mismanagement. It had built the cars that won a war and the cars that saved a company. In the end, it couldn't save itself. How does the plant that rescued an American icon get erased by the very company it rescued? In 1908, Detroit was not yet the Motor City. It was becoming one. Everywhere you looked, someone was betting their fortune on the automobile. Factories were going up on empty lots. Engineers were arguing in back rooms. Money was moving fast, and nobody knew who would survive. One of those bets was placed on East Jefferson Avenue at the corner of Connor Street on the east side of Detroit. A company called Chalmers Motor Co. hired architect Albert Kahn, the man who would eventually define industrial America, to build something that had almost never been done before: a reinforced concrete automobile factory. No wood, no brick, concrete and steel, designed to last. It was built to outlive everything around it. Kahn's plant was enormous, multi-story, fireproof, flooded with natural light through its long industrial windows. It was, by the standards of 1908, a cathedral. Not a place of worship, but a place of work. And in early 20th century Detroit, those were often the same thing. Chalmers did well at first, then it didn't. The cars got more expensive, the buyers disappeared. By the late 1910s, Chalmers had leased space to Maxwell Motor Car Company, another struggling automaker, and the two companies limped along together. Practically merged, practically broke. Their creditors needed someone to fix the mess. They found Walter P. Chrysler. By 1925, Chrysler had seen enough. He discontinued both brands, reorganized the company under his own name, and claimed Jefferson Avenue as the flagship plant of a new American automaker, Chrysler Corporation. The factory that Chalmers built and that Maxwell borrowed now belonged to the third largest automaker in the United States. For the workers of Detroit's East Side, it didn't matter much who owned the sign above the gate. What mattered was that the line kept moving, and for decades it did. When the Second World War arrived, Jefferson Avenue didn't slow down. It transformed. The assembly lines that built Chrysler sedans were retooled almost overnight. By 1942, the plant was producing 150,000 engines for the war effort. It built pontoon bridges, it built air raid sirens, it built wings for Curtiss-Wright fighter planes. The men who had spent years fitting dashboards and door panels were now manufacturing the machinery of survival. Detroit called itself the Arsenal of Democracy. Jefferson Avenue was one of the reasons that name meant something. When the war ended and the soldiers came home, the plant came back to life. The post-war boom hit Detroit like a wave. Americans had money, optimism, and an appetite for automobiles that the industry had never seen before. Jefferson Avenue answered. By the mid-1950s, 16,500 workers moved through its gates across 3 shifts. The line never slept. Imperials, New Yorkers. The finest cars Chrysler made, built right here on East Jefferson by men and women who had also built the weapons that won the war. The plant had survived the collapse of 2 companies, a world war and a second world war. It had outlived every automaker that originally built it. It felt by then like it could outlive anything. Chapter 3, The American Dream Assembled Daily. In the 1950s, a job at Jefferson Avenue wasn't just a job, it was a life plan. The wages were union wages, UAW wages, and they were good. Triple the federal minimum. Enough to buy a house on the east side, 2 blocks from the plant if you wanted. Enough to put kids through school. Enough to take a vacation in the summer and still have something left over. For the sons and daughters of immigrants, for the black workers who had migrated north from Alabama and Georgia and Mississippi looking for something better. Jefferson Avenue was the answer to the question their parents had been asking their whole lives. You worked hard. The company rewarded you. That was the deal. The east side of Detroit in those years was its own world. On Courchevel Avenue, on Mack, on East Jefferson itself, the neighborhood around the plant was dense with the infrastructure that grows up around steady industrial work. Bars where first shift drank after clocking out at 3 in the afternoon. Diners that opened at 4 in the morning for the workers going in. Barber shops and hardware stores and credit unions that existed because the people who lived within walking distance of Jefferson Avenue had reliable paychecks and spent them locally. The plant and the neighborhood were not separate things. They were the same organism. Families built their lives around the Jefferson schedule. A father on first shift, home by 4. A mother who had taken a clerical job at the plant during the war and never left. A son who graduated high school in June and started on the line in September, following a path that felt less like a choice than a natural continuation, the way water follows the channel that's already been cut. For black workers especially, Jefferson Avenue represented something that the rest of Detroit's economy was slower to offer. Union wages, union protections, and a grievance process that meant a foreman couldn't simply fire you because he felt like it. The UAW contract was not perfect. The plant floor was not without its tensions. But the paycheck was the same color, regardless of who earned it. And in mid-century America, that was not nothing. It was, for many families, everything. The veterans of Jefferson Avenue carried the plant with them the way veterans carry their service. Not always visibly, but permanently. Men who had spent 30 years on the line developed a physical relationship with the work that didn't leave them when they clocked out. The particular angle of a wrist when tightening a specific bolt. The way you positioned your feet on the concrete to absorb 8 hours of standing. The internal clock that knew, without checking, exactly how far down the line the next station was and how many seconds you had before the car moved on. This was expertise, genuine, irreplaceable, accumulated expertise, the kind that cannot be downloaded or automated or replaced in a training seminar. It lived in the bodies of the people who did the work, and it disappeared with them when the work was taken away. The plant itself had its own rhythm, its own internal logic. First shift arrived before dawn. The line came up slow, like an engine warming in cold weather, and then it found its pace. A pace that didn't change for 8 hours. Every worker had a station. Every station had a role. A door panel here, a steering column there. The body drops onto the chassis with a sound you felt in your chest, not just your ears. At the end of the line, a finished automobile rolled out under its own power. It happened hundreds of times a day. It never got ordinary. The noise inside Jefferson was constant, not chaotic, but layered. Metal on metal. Air tools, the low hum of the conveyor. Veterans of the plant could tell you, by sound alone, whether the line was running clean or whether something was off 3 stations ahead. It was a skill you couldn't learn in a classroom. You absorbed it over years, the way a musician learns to hear inside a chord. These workers were craftsmen. They just happened to be craftsmen in a factory. Chrysler, at its best, knew what it had. The company's engineering reputation in the 1950s was genuine. Its torsion bar suspension, its Hemi engine, its forward-looking designs gave it a credibility that the other 2 of the big 3 respected and sometimes envied. Jefferson Avenue was the physical expression of that pride. When a New Yorker rolled off the line, it wasn't just transportation, it was a statement. Could anyone standing on that floor in 1955, surrounded by 16,500 co-workers in the oldest and proudest plant in Detroit, have imagined what was coming? Through the late 1960s, something shifted inside Chrysler's executive offices in Highland Park. The engineers who had run the company, the men who argued about suspension geometry and engine tolerances, began to lose ground to a different kind of executive. Accountants, Financial managers, men who looked at a car and saw a margin, not a machine. CEO Lynn Townsend, who took over in 1961, was brilliant with numbers and indifferent to product. Under his watch, Chrysler cut engineering staff, chased short-term profit, and quietly let the culture of craftsmanship erode. The workers at Jefferson Avenue kept showing up. The line kept moving, but the decisions being made above them were growing dangerous. By 1976, the evidence was undeniable. Chrysler launched the Dodge Aspen and Plymouth Volare to enormous early demand, and immediately became a case study in what happens when you rush a car to market before it's ready. Hoods flew open at highway speed. Brakes failed. Steering columns separated. The company issued recall after recall. Consumer confidence collapsed. Sales that should have carried Chrysler through the decade turned into a public embarrassment. On Jefferson Avenue, the workers assembled what they were told to assemble. They had no vote on the engineering decisions made upstairs. They had no say in the cost-cutting that hollowed out quality control. But they would be the ones standing in the unemployment line when the bill came due. In 1978, Jefferson switched from passenger cars to small truck production. The first sign that its role was changing, its future uncertain. Then the oil crisis deepened. Then the recession hit. Then the Japanese imports arrived with a reliability that American consumers hadn't known was possible. By 1979, Chrysler's market share had fallen to 9%. The company was burning through cash it didn't have. In September of that year, Chrysler formally petitioned the United States government for $1.5 billion in loan guarantees to avoid bankruptcy. It was the largest government bailout in American history, and the man they brought in to spend that money, to bet the entire company on one last desperate product, would walk into Jefferson Avenue, look his workers in the eye, and make them a promise. A promise Jefferson Avenue would spend the rest of its life trying to keep. Lee Iacocca arrived at Chrysler in November 1978 with something to prove. He had spent 32 years at Ford. He had created the Mustang. He had built a career that made him one of the most recognized executives in the American automobile industry. And then Henry Ford II had fired him, personally without warning, for reasons that were never fully explained, and left him standing in the parking lot of a company he had helped make great. Iacocca was 54 years old. He was angry, and he was not finished. Chrysler was, by any reasonable measure, a disaster. The product line was a tangle of outdated models with almost no parts compatibility between them. Quality control was inconsistent. Morale was broken. The company had too many plants, too many platforms, and not enough customers. When Iacocca arrived and started pulling back the curtain, he later said it was worse than anything he had imagined. But somewhere inside that wreckage, he saw something. His longtime colleague Hal Sperlich had come to Chrysler a year earlier, bringing with him a set of blueprints that Ford had repeatedly rejected. A front-wheel drive compact platform, efficient, modular, designed to underpin an entire family of vehicles from a single architecture. Ford didn't want it. Chrysler, desperate and out of options, had nothing to lose. Iacocca looked at Sperlich's platform. Then he looked at Jefferson Avenue. The plant was aging, but it had infrastructure, experience, and a workforce that knew how to build cars. It had survived 80 years of American industrial history. If any factory in Detroit could be retooled fast enough to save a dying company, it was this one. The decision was made. Jefferson Avenue would build the K-car. It was not a modest bet. Chrysler invested $100 million in retooling the plant for front-wheel drive production. Money the company technically didn't have, borrowed against government loan guarantees that hadn't yet been approved. If Congress said no, if the cars didn't sell, if the recession deepened any further, it was over. Not restructuring, not Chapter 11. Over. The entire future of the third largest automaker in America came down to one plant, on one street, in a city that was already losing its faith in the automobile industry. Part B, summer, 1980. Jefferson Avenue was being rebuilt from the inside out. While Chrysler's accountants were calculating how many weeks of cash remained, the workers at Jefferson were learning a new assembly process. Front-wheel drive was a fundamentally different architecture from anything the plant had built before. The engine sat transversely, sideways across the engine bay. The drivetrain ran forward, not back. Everything about the way the car was put together had changed. The workers adapted. That was what they did. In the fall of 1980, the first production K cars, the Dodge Aries and the Plymouth Reliant, began rolling off the Jefferson Avenue line. They were not beautiful cars. They were boxy, utilitarian, aggressively practical. 4 doors, front-wheel drive, a 2.2-liter four-cylinder engine, and enough interior room for a family of 5. No pretense, no excess. They were exactly what a country in recession needed. The moment Iacocca had been building toward came on a floor crowded with workers who had retooled an entire plant in months, who had absorbed a new platform under financial pressure that would have paralyzed most organizations. He walked the line. He shook hands. And then he climbed into the first production K car, drove it to the end of the floor, and out through the factory doors. The workers cheered, not because they were told to, because they understood what they had just done. Within a year, Chrysler sold 410,000 K cars, more than double the sales of the rear-wheel drive models they replaced. By 1983, the cash flow from Jefferson Avenue's line had funded something even larger: the Dodge Caravan and Plymouth Voyager, the first modern minivans, built on the same K-car platform. The minivan would go on to lead American auto sales for 25 years. And in the summer of 1983, Iacocca stood before the cameras and announced that Chrysler had paid back its entire $833 million government loan, 7 years ahead of schedule. The government had not lost a dollar. It had made $500 million in profit from the deal. Chrysler was alive. Jefferson Avenue had done it. The plant that had been retooled in desperation, that had bet its workers' futures on a boxy compact nobody thought was glamorous, had pulled the third largest automaker in America back from the edge of extinction. For one brief moment, it must have felt like the debt ran both ways. It didn't. Chapter 5. Musical Plants. The 1980s were good to Chrysler. Almost too good. Good enough to make the company forget what had nearly killed it. The K-car platform turned out to be more than a rescue vehicle. It was a foundation. Chrysler's engineers stretched it, widened it, lengthened it, and built nearly 50 different models on top of it across the decade. The Chrysler LeBaron, the Dodge 600, the New Yorker with its digital dashboard, the Daytona with its turbocharged engine, each one a variation on the same bones that Jefferson Avenue had been building since 1980. The platform that saved the company became the platform that defined it. Market share climbed from 9% in 1980 to 14% by 1988. Profits returned. Iacocca became a celebrity. His autobiography, published in 1984, was the best-selling nonfiction hardback in the country for 2 consecutive years. He was on television constantly, staring into cameras, making promises in that particular tone of voice that made you believe he meant every one of them. For the workers at Jefferson Avenue, the recovery was real. The line was running. The paychecks were coming. The plant that had nearly been the site of Chrysler's death had become, instead, the engine of its resurrection. But corporations have a way of forgetting their debts the moment the crisis passes. In 1987, Iacocca made a move that would quietly begin to shift the company's priorities. Chrysler acquired American Motors Corporation, a struggling competitor, primarily to get its hands on one thing: the Jeep brand. AMC's engineers had already done most of the development work on a new model, the Grand Cherokee. It was exactly the kind of truck-based SUV that American consumers were beginning to want. Big, capable, profitable. Iacocca wanted it badly, and to build it, he needed a plant. In 1988, Chrysler announced it would build a brand new assembly complex on the south side of East Jefferson Avenue, directly across from the old plant. The new facility would be state-of-the-art, purpose-built for SUV production, capable of turning out the Grand Cherokee at the volumes Chrysler projected it would need. The price tag, $1 billion. At the announcement, Chrysler made a commitment to the workers and to the city of Detroit. The old Jefferson Avenue plant would remain open and operational through 1992, when the new facility would be ready to come online. Nobody would be left behind. The transition would be managed responsibly. It was the kind of promise that sounds reasonable in a press release. It is the kind of promise that gets forgotten when the numbers change. Through 1988 and into 1989, something was happening to Jefferson Avenue that had a name inside the industry. Musical plants. Chrysler, having acquired AMC and inherited its Kenosha, Wisconsin factory, found itself with more production capacity than it needed. Rather than make hard decisions cleanly, the company began shuffling product between facilities, moving the Omni and Horizon from Kenosha to Jefferson. Not because Jefferson was the right long-term home for those cars, but because it was a way to keep the old plant technically operational while the company figured out its next move. The workers at Jefferson Avenue understood what was happening. They had been in this industry long enough to recognize the signs. Production that gets shuffled in is production that can be shuffled out. Models near the end of their life cycle don't get sent to plants with long futures. By early 1988, Jefferson's workforce had already fallen to around 3,500, a fraction of the 16,500 who had worked there at the plant's peak. Then came another round of layoffs, then another. The evening shift was cut first, 1,800 workers, gone 13 months before the final closure. On January 16, 1990, Chrysler officials sat down with UAW representatives and delivered a number. The plant was selling only 160 of the 470 Omni and Horizon subcompacts it could produce each day. The math was brutal and simple. You could not keep a plant open to build cars nobody was buying. The closure was announced, not for 1992 as promised, for February 1990. Was this a business decision or a broken promise? In the end, is there even a difference? When the people paying the price are the ones who were never in the room when the promise was made? Chapter 6, The Last Shift. When the announcement came, Doris Murphy had been at Jefferson Avenue for 21 years. She had started on the line when the plant was still running full strength. 3 shifts, thousands of workers, the kind of operation that felt permanent because it had always been there and you couldn't imagine it not being there. She had shown up every day. She had done her job. She had believed the way you believe in things that have never failed you, that the company would take care of her. 21 years, that was supposed to mean something. I always believed that after I had 21 years in at a company, I wouldn't have anything to worry about, she told the Detroit Free Press on the day the closure was announced. This makes you realize that nothing's permanent. There is a particular kind of devastation in those words. Not rage, not bitterness, just the quiet collapse of an assumption that had organized a life. Murphy wasn't describing a broken contract. She was describing something deeper. The moment a person discovers that loyalty in a corporation's ledger has no line item. She was not alone. The weeks between the January announcement and the February 2nd closure had a quality that people who lived through them have struggled to describe accurately. It was not grief exactly. Grief comes after loss. This was something that happens before, the period when the loss is certain but not yet complete, when you are still going through the motions of a life that has already been decided against you. Workers who had spent decades building routines around the Jefferson schedule found themselves performing those routines with a new and terrible awareness of each one. The alarm at 5:15, the coffee made the same way it had been made for 20 years. The drive down East Jefferson in the dark, the plant's lights visible from 3 blocks away, the parking spot you had claimed through sheer consistency of habit. All of it continued. All of it was ending. On the floor, the conversations had a different texture. Veterans who had never been particularly reflective about their work found themselves talking about it, about specific cars they remembered building, about the changes they had seen over the years, about the people who had retired or transferred or died and left gaps in the social fabric of the line. There was a collective taking of stock, an informal and uncoordinated accounting of what this place had meant. Younger workers, those with 5 or 8 years in, workers who had arrived after the K-car rescue and known Jefferson Avenue only in its diminished late-period form, watched the veterans and understood that they were witnessing something they had not been present for the beginning of. The people with 20 and 30 years on the line were grieving a relationship. The newer workers were grieving a job. These were not the same thing, and everyone knew it. The UAW local did what it could. There were meetings. There were discussions about transfer rights, about pension calculations, about who might qualify for positions at other Chrysler facilities. The language of these meetings was practical and procedural because practical and procedural was the only language available. There was no language for what it means when the institution that organized your adult life decides, in a boardroom you will never enter, that your years no longer fit its plans. Doris Murphy had found that language, plain and exact, in a single sentence to a reporter. Nothing's permanent. Robert Garnett had worked at Jefferson Avenue for 20 years before he was laid off 13 months earlier, part of the evening shift that was cut in early 1989. By the time the final closure was announced, he had already been living with the aftermath. The uncertainty, the job searches, the calculations about what a 50-something auto worker does when the only industry he knows has decided it no longer needs him. After you've given a company 20 years of your life, Garnett said, they figure you're wore out. They want young people who won't break down on them. The language is plain. The wound underneath it is not. These were not men and women who had been passive passengers in their own careers. They had shown up year after year through the near bankruptcy and the retooling and the desperate K-car gamble. They had been part of the rescue. They had clapped when Iacocca drove that first car off the line. They had believed they were building something that would last. What they had actually been doing, it turned out, was buying time for a company that was already planning its next chapter, one that didn't include them. In the final weeks of January 1990, Jefferson Avenue kept running. That was the strange thing. The announcement had been made. The date had been set. Everyone inside the plant knew what February 2nd meant, and yet the line kept moving. Because there were still cars to build, still orders to fill, still a production quota to meet until the very last shift of the very last day. The final product rolling off Jefferson Avenue's line was the 1990 Dodge Omni and Plymouth Horizon, two subcompacts that had been in production in various forms since 1978. They were not glamorous cars. They had never been glamorous cars. But in 1990, in what would turn out to be their final model year, they received something they had never had before: a redesigned dashboard, a driver's side airbag, improved rear shoulder belts, and a refined 2.5-liter fuel-injected engine. The best version of the Omni and Horizon, the safest, most refined iteration in 12 years of production, was being assembled by workers who knew they were building the last ones. There is something unbearable about that detail if you sit with it long enough. The workers didn't slow down. That was not who they were. The culture of the line, the discipline, the rhythm, the professional pride that 20 or 30 years of experience builds into a person, didn't disappear because a closure had been announced. If anything, the veterans of Jefferson Avenue worked those final weeks the way they had always worked, with their hands, with their knowledge, with the quiet competence of people who understood that the car coming off the end of the line would be driven by someone who had no idea it was built by a workforce counting down its final days. Lee Iacocca met with UAW President Owen Bieber in those final weeks to discuss the closure. The meeting was described as a discussion. There was nothing left to discuss. The decision had been made at levels far above the plant floor, in offices far from East Jefferson Avenue, by people who would not be standing at the gate on February 2nd. The workers knew this. They showed up anyway. Chapter 7, February 1990. Detroit in February is a particular kind of cold. Not the dramatic cold of a blizzard, not the kind that makes headlines. Just a gray, settled, bone-deep cold that has been there so long it no longer feels like weather. It feels like the city's natural state. The sky, the color of old concrete, the ground frozen hard. The kind of morning where you pull your coat tighter, not because the wind is strong, but because the air itself has weight. That was the morning of February 8th, 1990. First shift arrived the way first shift always arrived. Before dawn, in the dark, headlights moving slowly through the east side streets. They parked where they always parked. They walked through the gates they had walked through hundreds of times before. They clocked in. Inside, the plant looked the way it always looked. The line was there. The fixtures were there. The tools were in their places. 82 years of industrial infrastructure, built by Albert Kahn in 1908 to last forever, still standing exactly as it had stood through 2 world wars and a Great Depression and the near death of the company that owned it. Everything was the same, except everyone knew it was the last time. The veterans moved through the final morning with a deliberateness that the newer workers noticed and remembered afterward. There were men on that floor who had been at Jefferson Avenue for 30 years, who had arrived as teenagers in the early 1960s, when the plant was still running close to full strength, when 1,500 workers meant 3 full shifts and a waiting list for open positions. Men who had learned the line from workers who had built war engines in the 1940s, who carried inside them an institutional memory that stretched back further than most corporations bother to document. They were not sentimental people, in the way that word is usually meant. Sentimentality is a luxury of distance. These were men and women who had been inside the work for decades, who understood it from the inside rather than the outside, and who had very little patience for the romanticization of labor that people practice when they are not the ones doing it. But on this morning, some of them ran their hands along surfaces they were passing for the last time. A support column near a familiar station. The edge of a workbench worn smooth by years of use. Not performance. Nobody was watching. Nobody was filming. Just the private, wordless acknowledgement that a body makes when it understands it is saying goodbye to a place that has shaped it. Outside the plant, the east side of Detroit was waking up the way it always woke up in February. Reluctantly, under a sky the color of steel. The corner stores along Jefferson were opening. The bus routes that had carried workers to this plant for decades were running their morning schedules, picking up passengers who would, starting tomorrow, have no reason to get off at this stop. The neighborhood already knew. In the close geography of working-class Detroit, where the plan and the street and the household were woven together in ways that urban planners never fully mapped, the closure of Jefferson Avenue was not an abstraction. It was the end of something that had structured daily life. The shift changes that determined when traffic moved on East Jefferson, the payday Fridays that determined when the bars were full, the particular sound of the plant at full production that residents within a mile had long since stopped consciously hearing, but would notice acutely in its absence. A city learns the sound of its own industry. It does not always know this until the sound stops. The final Dodge Omni moved down the line the way every Omni before it had moved. Station by station, worker by worker, each person doing what they had always done. A door panel fitted, a dashboard secured, an engine lowered into place. The accumulated knowledge of thousands of hours of labor compressed into one last car. When it reached the end of the line, it rolled out under its own power. It was not a ceremony. There was no executive present to mark the moment, no photographer positioned to capture it for a press release. The last car built at Jefferson Avenue left the line the same way the first one had in 1908, simply without fanfare, because that was how the work had always been done here. The work did not require an audience. It never had. The workers who built it knew what it meant. That was enough. By mid-morning, the line had stopped for the last time. The silence that followed was not the silence of a break or a shift change or a temporary shutdown. It was a different kind of silence, the kind that fills a space when the thing that has always defined that space is gone. Workers who had spent decades calibrating their internal rhythms to the sound of the Jefferson Avenue line stood in a quiet that none of them had ever heard inside these walls before. Then they gathered what they had, and they walked out, 1,700 workers, through the same gates, into the same February cold. It had been exactly 10 years since the morning Iacocca drove the first K car off this floor to the sound of those same workers cheering. 10 years since the plant had been the site of a comeback story that the entire country was watching. 10 years since Jefferson Avenue had proven that American manufacturing could still do the impossible when it had to. A decade. That was what the rescue had bought. What do you call a plant that outlived every automaker that built it, that survived 2 world wars, the Depression, and the near collapse of the company it served, only to be abandoned by the one company it actually saved? The gates closed behind the last worker. Outside, Detroit absorbed the news the way Detroit had been absorbing news like this for years, with the particular weariness of a city that has lost count of how many times it has been told that this closure, this one, is the last one. Jefferson Avenue joining the list that already included Hudson, Packard, Briggs, Dodge, Maine, the great industrial landmarks of a city that had once been the manufacturing capital of the world. With Jefferson gone, Detroit was left with a single automobile assembly plant operating within its city limits. GM's Poletown facility near Hamtramck. One plant. In the city that had invented the moving assembly line, that had built the arsenal of democracy, that had once employed hundreds of thousands of workers within walking distance of their homes. One plant, the oldest assembly plant in American history, had just closed. The building still stood, for now, but Jefferson Avenue, as it had existed for 82 years, was over. What happened next was, in its own way, worse. Chapter 8. The Demolition Commercial. In March 1991, 13 months after the last worker walked out, Chrysler imploded the Jefferson Avenue plant. Not quietly, not privately, not with any of the solemnity that 82 years of history might have warranted. They filmed it. The demolition was captured on camera and edited into a television commercial. In it, Iacocca stood before the new Jefferson North Assembly Complex, gleaming, modern, purpose-built for the Jeep Grand Cherokee, and used the destruction of the old plant as evidence of Chrysler's commitment to Detroit. The message was carefully constructed. We are not leaving. We are investing. We are building the future right here on the same ground where we built the past. The old plant came down in 10 seconds of controlled implosion. 82 years of Albert Kahn's reinforced concrete, the arsenal of democracy, the floor where the K car was born, collapsed into rubble, on cue for a 30-second advertisement. There is a word for what Chrysler did with that footage. It is not a flattering word. To be precise, it was the adjacent Courchevel body plant, connected to Jefferson by a bridge over Jefferson Avenue since the 1950s, whose implosion was used most prominently in the commercial. But the distinction mattered little to the workers who had spent their careers inside the complex. To them, it was all Jefferson Avenue. It was all gone, and the company that had taken it from them had turned the demolition into a marketing moment. Iacocca looked into the camera the way he always looked into cameras, direct, confident, entirely at ease with his own narrative. This was not a loss, the commercial implied. This was progress, the old making way for the new, Detroit moving forward. What the commercial did not mention was what had happened to the 1,700 workers who had walked out of that plant 13 months earlier. Chrysler had promised, at the time of the closure, that many Jefferson Avenue workers would be called back to staff the new Jefferson North plant when it opened in 1992. The new facility would employ approximately 2,500 workers, building Jeep Grand Cherokees on a platform that had nothing to do with the K car, requiring skills and certifications that the old Jefferson workforce had not been trained for. The plant was designed for a different era of manufacturing. The workers who had spent 20 years learning the rhythms of the old line were not automatically transferable to the new one. Some were called back. Many were not. The calculus was familiar and brutal. Workers in their 50s with 20 or 30 years of seniority were expensive. Entry-level positions at the new plant paid less. Younger workers without the accumulated benefits and pension obligations of the veterans were more attractive on a balance sheet. The men and women who had retooled Jefferson Avenue in 1980 under financial duress, who had built the cars that paid back the government loan 7 years early, who had clapped when Iacocca drove that first K car off the floor, they aged out of the calculation. Robert Garnett had said it plainly, a year before the closure. They figure you're wore out. He was right. Meanwhile, the new Jefferson North opened to considerable fanfare in 1992. Iacocca, who retired from Chrysler at the end of that same year, presided over the launch of the Jeep Grand Cherokee as one of his final acts as chairman. The vehicle was a sensation. Within a year, more than 300,000 were being produced annually. By 2013, the plant would produce its 5 millionth vehicle. The success was real. The investment was real. Detroit had, by any measurable standard, a functioning, thriving automobile plant where a crumbling one used to stand. What it did not have was a memory. The workers who built the cars that made all of this possible, who bought Chrysler the time and the cash and the credibility to survive long enough to build a billion-dollar facility on East Jefferson Avenue had been written out of the story before the story was finished. Their chapter ended on February 2nd. Chrysler's next chapter began the day the cameras rolled on the demolition. The Jeep Grand Cherokee is still being built on East Jefferson Avenue today. The plant is called Detroit Assembly Complex. Jefferson now, after several rounds of corporate rebranding that followed Chrysler's absorption into Daimler Chrysler, then Cerberus, then Fiat Chrysler, then Stellantis. The ownership has changed 4 times since Iacocca retired. The name above the gate has changed with it. But the address is the same. The ground is the same ground. Somewhere underneath the parking lot and the modern assembly infrastructure, there is concrete that Albert Kahn poured in 1908. The workers on the current line build excellent vehicles. They show up before dawn, they clock in, they do skilled and difficult work, and they go home. Some of them may know in a general way that there was an older plant here before this one. Most of them have no particular reason to know the name Doris Murphy or Robert Garnett or what those names represent. That is not their fault. That is what institutional forgetting looks like from the inside. Not a decision, not a conspiracy, just the ordinary passage of time and the tendency of corporations to curate the parts of their history that reflect well on them. Chrysler's official history of the K-car era is a success story, and it is in every measurable sense true. The car saved the company, Iacocca paid back the loans, the minivan defined a generation of American family life. These things happened. They are worth remembering. What is less frequently told is where those cars were built and by whom, and what happened to those people when the building that had given their working lives meaning was reduced to rubble and used as a backdrop for a television advertisement. History remembers the product. It rarely remembers the floor it was built on. It almost never remembers the hands. Chrysler went bankrupt in 2009. Not the Jefferson North plant, the company itself. The same corporation that had paid back its government loans 7 years early in 1983, that had declared itself a symbol of American resilience, that had filmed the demolition of Jefferson Avenue and called it progress. Filed for Chapter 11 protection 26 years later, hollowed out by the same patterns of short-term thinking, deferred investment, and executive detachment from product reality that had nearly destroyed it the first time. The government stepped in again. Fiat acquired a controlling stake. The company was restructured, rebranded, eventually merged into the multinational conglomerate now called Stellantis. Iacocca, watching from retirement, told a reporter in 2009, "This is a sad day for me. It pains me to see my old company on the ropes, but Chrysler has been in trouble before, and we got through it." He was not wrong. Chrysler did get through it. Again. The pattern has a name in industrial history, the corporation as survivor, shedding workers and plants and promises the way a tree sheds leaves in autumn. Not out of malice, but out of the biological imperative to continue. The leaves are not the tree, the workers are not the company, the plant is not the brand. This is the logic that closed Jefferson Avenue in 19... It is the same logic that has closed plants in Kenosha and Fenton and Newark and 100 other American cities where the same transaction took place. A community gave a company its labor, its loyalty, and its years. And the company, when the calculation changed, gave back a severance check and a promise about the future that the community's children would not live to see fulfilled. When a company demolishes what saved it and calls the footage progress, when it erases 82 years of history in 10 seconds and airs it during a commercial break, what does that tell us about who corporations believe they owe something to? About what loyalty is worth when it only runs in one direction? The answer has been the same for as long as there have been factories. Jefferson Avenue is still there. The line is still running. The Jeeps roll out every day, under their own power, through gates that stand on the same ground where Doris Murphy once believed that 21 years meant something. She was not wrong to believe it. She was just working for the wrong kind of institution to have that belief honored. The plant that saved Chrysler is gone. The company it saved is still here, under a different name, owned by different people, building different cars on the same street, on the same frozen Detroit ground. And somewhere in the corporate archive, There is footage of the demolition. They used it in a commercial.